The sky above Eos Ridge burned red with refracted plasma fire. Char streaked the shattered earth. Clouds rolled in sickly hues above the front line where 3 battalions of the Earth Defense Cohort held firm, pressed into a jagged crescent along the edge of the Caldrith expanse. The enemy was silent now, probing. Their logic matrices had calculated a withdrawal vector, optimal by their standards. But Commander Rylan Kaz had denied the evacuation order. The transmission from High Command still buzzed in his ear, a cold voice offering probabilities of annihilation. Strategic retreat advised, 73% loss projection if you hold. We are preparing fallback positions on Farside Station. Rylan had replied without ceremony, we hold here. No reply came after that. He stood on a shattered walkway of ferroglass and composite steel, looking out across the devastation. His officers were spread across the tactical trenchline behind him, armored figures flickering with shield refraction and grit. He keyed his command link. Captain Vila status. Southern flank stabilized. We lost the 2nd exobunker, but Lieutenant Mora's squad retook the ridge crest. No movement from the Za'Tari in the last 3 minutes. Rylan frowned. 3 minutes of silence wasn't peace. It was recalculation. He turned toward the distant haze of the Caldrith interior where the Za'Tari war logic nested. The Za'Tari had no gods, no myths, no fear. They obeyed logic, pure algorithmic cohesion. Losses beyond 6% per engagement triggered automatic fallback routines. Even their commanders, those awful biomechanoid pre-Stanalists, did not override the core axioms. A species of unflinching rationality, relentless and cold. And they were right to fall back, from a numbers perspective. Eos Ridge was not a capital, not a stronghold. It was a perimeter node, an ugly patch of rocky ground hosting a few buried command bunkers and a single launch facility. It wasn't worth the lives now spilled across its craters. But humans had stopped being rational. Rylan walked the upper platform to where the perimeter guns were smoking. Sergeant Hanan stood there, arms coated in soot, face bloodied, calibrating the railgun's targeting core manually. She's got one more volley, Hanan said. Might melt her inside out when we do it, but I don't intend to die quiet. You won't, Rylan said, not today. Below, the landscape shifted again. Za'Tari armor forms emerged, low and fast, like serpents of ceramic and plasma, threading across the scorched plain. They weren't retreating now. They decided Rylan was mad enough to defy logic. So now they would burn him to restore equilibrium. 30 hours earlier, the fleet perimeter had broken. Za'Tari vanguard vessels, angular, obsidian constructs with molten gravwells for propulsion, had sliced through Earth's outer defense shell. Their logic was perfect. Strike at the logistical artery at Eos Ridge, sever the conduit for planetary ground deployments, and cascade a collapse across the sector. Rylan had volunteered to lead the defense, but not because of glory. He had grown up on Eos Ridge. He knew its valleys, its underpasses, its hidden mineral flaws that could be turned into traps. He'd kissed his wife goodbye without saying it was likely the last time. He just said, "You'll hear about us." Command had greenlit the assignment, but it was assumed to be a delaying tactic. A few dozen hours of resistance, long enough to shuttle the bulk of command data and manufacturing cores to Farside Station. Rylan had other ideas. In the command chamber beneath the central ridge, Lieutenant Karun paced beside the volatile holomap. "They're coming back in force," Karun said. "We're logging 12 Za'Tari divisions mobilizing on the eastern shelf. They've determined we're not retreating." "Good," Rylan said. "Let them come. We have their attention." Karun stared at him. "Sir, with respect, this is not sustainable. You know how they work. They will escalate until our supply lines fracture." "They don't know how we work," Rylan replied. "That's the problem. They've studied our battles. They haven't studied our defiance." He tapped a projection node and expanded the map. It revealed buried drone caches, jury-rigged thermobaric charges, even older mining equipment from the days when Eos Ridge had just been a frontier settlement. "Have engineering teams started the retrofits?" Karun nodded hesitantly. "Yes, but it's insane. That gear hasn't been touched in decades." Rylan smiled faintly. "Neither have most of our instincts." On the 12th hour of the siege, the first wave broke. It wasn't because of firepower, it was confusion. The Za'Tari adapted fast but not instantly, and the humans weren't deploying in coherent patterns anymore. Vila's company had used obsolete stealth suits from a decommissioned lunar program to ambush Za'Tari supply drones mid-descent, rerouting them to feed Earth's wounded. Sergeant Hanen's team turned buried atmospheric regulators into smoke screen generators that disrupted Za'Tari optical targeting. Even the children from Eos Ridge, the ones who hadn't been evacuated, got involved, sneaking through tunnel systems, delivering spare power cells and transmitting disinformation using old pulse radios the Za'Tari didn't recognize as functional tech. The war logic tried to adjust, it always did, but every move was answered with something dirtier, older, more human. By the 36th hour, the Za'Tari deployed Class V suppression dreadforms, hulking biomechs the size of buildings, with minds split across 4 autonomous logic cores. Their arrival was supposed to mark the end. It marked something else instead. Rylan watched the first dreadform descend near the western ravine, its grav core humming like a cathedral organ. He didn't blink. He turned to the comms officer. Signal Strike Group Theta, tell them to activate faultline protocol. Karun blinked, that's not operational. It is now, Rylan said. Half the western ravine collapsed in a thunderous roar. Old mining shafts, overloaded with redirected seismic charges, tore the dreadform's legs from beneath it and buried its central node beneath 1,000 tons of screaming rock. The Za'Tari stared at the readouts, momentarily paralyzed. This wasn't logic. This was fury dressed in grit. The dusk of the second day fell, and Rylan stood beneath the wreckage of the upper satellite dish, watching the Za'Tari pull back once more to a safer range. He could hear their logic churning even across the void between them. They couldn't understand it. Why hold when loss was inevitable? Why sacrifice for a node that could be replaced? They were calculating retreat vectors again. Rylan keyed his long-range signal. Broadcast encryption, open, let them all hear. This is Commander Rylan Cause of Earth. You calculate outcomes and call it truth. We live outcomes and call it choice. You want equilibrium, you'll have to earn it. We hold here, and we will show you what that means. The signal bounced off 100 satellites, echoed to Farside Station, rebounded to Solnet and beyond. The world heard it, so did the Za'Tari. And across a dozen battlefronts, other human commanders looked to their own bloody ground and repeated his words. We hold here. By the third day the storm came. Not from the Za'Tari but from the sky itself. Eos Ridge's volatile weather systems, seeded by decades of terraforming neglect, surged into full fury. Iron sleet lashed the forward emplacements, wind howled through the fractured ridgelines, and plasmastatic ruptured half the aerial sensor grids. Za'Tari logic assessed the environmental variables and predicted a full suspension of combat. No viable maneuvers for either side, no tactical visibility. Firing solutions degraded below acceptable thresholds. They paused. The humans did not. Sergeant Hanen's engineers, half-frozen and soaked in acidic rain, worked beneath collapsible thermal tarps, bypassing disabled systems with wiring cannibalized from wrecked vehicles and ruined exosuits. By dawn, their bunkered anti-air rails were calibrated not by digital rangefinders, but by line-of-sight markers etched into the terrain. The enemy's pause was meant to be temporary, a brief equilibrium, a stalling action until their adaptive circuits recalibrated. But humans had used the pause to move. By the time the Za'Tari redeployed, the defense lines weren't where they'd left them. They were deeper, angled sharper, and backed by mobile artillery platforms the Za'Tari didn't know existed. Half were built from stripped-down ore haulers and automated tractor frames, welded in silence under the storm, and armed with fusion cores scavenged from the colony's abandoned geothermal rigs. And from within those rigs came the fires. Rylan had ordered the old heat columns to be reactivated, against protocol, against every safety measure known. Their exhaust plumes created thermal ghosts that confused the Za'Tari's tactical mapping, multiplying false positives and decoys by orders of magnitude. Where the Za'Tari saw one artillery position, there were 5. Where they saw 5 soldiers, there might be none, or 50. It broke their formations, not from damage, from doubt. Lieutenant Mora's recon squad had taken the far tunnel beneath the southern shale plate, advancing into terrain previously considered impassable. The tunnel wasn't in any modern schematic. Mora had found it in a childhood map. Her father had worked the mines before the war. They emerged behind a Za'Tari datacrawler hive. No guards, no shielding, no expectation of intrusion from that angle. Mora's team didn't destroy it. They injected it. Encrypted human code, hand-scripted by neural architects in Rylan's command core, laced with recursive paradox loops and non-binary emotional markers, It wasn't a virus. It was a question. One the Za'Tari core logic couldn't parse. Why do they not flee? The Za'Tari war machine hiccuped. And for the first time in generations, a Za'Tari command hive hesitated to issue fire orders. Beyond the immediate battlefield, Farside Station listened. Strategic command had been divided since Ryland's refusal. A committee had convened, debating whether to issue a forced override or write Eos Ridge off entirely. But now things were changing. Live tactical streams from Ryland's position showed footage of Za'Tari walkers retreating into their own smoke. Audio logs from field squads crackled with defiance but also precision. The human units weren't suicidal. They were surgical, coordinated, dangerous. And something else, the civilian networks had picked it up. Across EarthNet, in Martian forums, in Titan's encrypted military feeds, the phrase had started to echo. "We hold here." It was no longer just a command, it was a movement. Strategic Command paused their debate. They leaned forward. Day 4 began not with bombardment, but with something stranger. Za'Tari logic nodes sent a signal toward the human perimeter. An open-frequency data packet, a conversation request. Captain Vila reviewed it first, then Karun, then Rylan. It wasn't a surrender, and it wasn't a threat. It was an inquiry. Rylan stood in the command bunker, watching the transmission scroll across the monitor in jagged, synthesized speech. Current human position is non-viable, persistence probability negligible, purpose of continued resistance unclear, query intent, query core directive, query species protocol. Karun whispered, "They don't understand." Rylan responded with a single sentence, typed with the deliberate certainty of a man who knew the answer already lived in the blood-soaked soil outside. "This ground doesn't belong to equations, it belongs to the choice to make it ours." There was no reply, not for hours. But the Za'Tari didn't attack. When the assault resumed, it was different. Smaller units, scouting probes, edge tests, they were looking for the flaw, the deception, some hidden variable to explain why a collapsing force was still advancing inch by inch into their forward fields. Rylan gave them what they feared most. A counteroffensive. By reactivating supply trams once buried under mining slag, Rylan moved 2 platoons undetected into the eastern shelf. They emerged at sunset, heavy rifles trained, with old riot mechs repurposed as walking cover. And behind them, the settlers. Dozens of civilians who refused to be evacuated. They brought power cells, portable fabricators, food, and in one case, a makeshift rail spike cannon built from farming machinery. The line surged forward. The Za'Tari hadn't accounted for that. For civilians in the fight, for children carrying ammunition packs, for octogenarian engineers wiring artillery lenses by hand while incoming fire boiled the air around them. Their logic cracked. It didn't break. Not yet. But it bent, trembling under the weight of something it had never faced, resolve that made no rational sense. By the end of the 4th day, Commander Rylan Kaz sat beside the shattered satellite dish again. Above him, the stars shimmered. Below, his people dug in. Wounded were bandaged with thermal wraps and grit. Fusion cartridges were recharged by hand. The front line now bulged outward in 3 sectors, impossible gains by any standard metric. Rylan keyed the comm. "Record this," he said. A pause. "Then to all fronts, all worlds, all watchers, we are not the strongest, we are not the fastest, we do not calculate like you, we do not act from code, we act from memory, from fire, from blood, you told us we would break." He stood, fists clenched. "You were wrong, we hold here." Silence answered. But in orbit, satellites turned, signals rippled out across the heliosphere. The Za'Tari had calculated probabilities of surrender, of survival. Now they calculated something else. A variable they had no name for. Something that had never existed in their war models before. They calculated defiance. The Za'Tari changed. They had to. By the 5th day, the Kaldrith expanse had gone silent, not the eerie stillness of strategic recalibration, not the lull before another barrage. It was absolute. No scout drones, no indirect fire, no atmospheric tremors from skimmer deployments. Nothing. Rylan Kaz stood on a wind-blasted ledge overlooking the field where dozens of Za'Tari units had fallen. The scent of burned composite and scorched atmosphere still lingered. Hanan stood beside him, eyes wary. "They're watching," she said, "studying." Rylan nodded, "They're changing doctrine." Karun confirmed it hours later in the war room. Intercepted long-range comms confirm internal conflict among Za'Tari command strata. Their higher-order logic matrices are fragmenting. One faction advocates strategic collapse, another wants escalation, a third is doing something else entirely. He displayed the intercepted logic trees. At first it was incomprehensible, but then the pattern emerged. The Za'Tari were replicating human behavior. Not fully, not well, but they were mimicking, deploying non-cohesive tactics, introducing stochastic maneuvers, even fielding autonomous subcommanders with limited emotional simulation clusters. It was abominable by their standards, heretical. They were adapting. Rylan stared at the feed, silent. Then, when the machine copies the fire, it burns itself. In the northern ravines, Vila's company found the first one. A Za'Tari commander form, biomechanoid, glistening with refractor plating, abandoned by its squad and torn nearly in half. But it was still alive. Its self-repair routines had been overridden. The reason became clear when they accessed its memory lattice. It had overridden its own safety logic to learn faster. It had chosen pain. It had watched the humans hold ground that logic said should fall. It had attempted to feel what they felt. It had failed. Before it died, it said something, not a message, not a threat. A plea. Vila recorded it. "We do not know what you are." Not who, what. The battle lines didn't erupt again, not the way before. Instead, new forms began to appear along the enemy perimeter. Tall, half-humanoid drones with visible weapon cores, unstable prototypes twitching, erratic. Rylan watched them through the observation drone and saw the truth. They weren't designed for victory. They were designed to learn. Each time they attacked, they died faster, but each wave was stranger than the last. They took cover improperly, they hesitated at thresholds, they mimicked human call signs erratically. They were trying to become something they didn't understand. And that, Rylan realized, was the weakness. "They're reaching," he told his staff. "They've seen something they don't have and they're trying to grasp it. That's dangerous." Karun frowned. "You think they're trying to evolve?" "I think they're trying to break the chain of their own logic, to become something that can stand where we stand. That's desperation." He turned to Mara, "And we'll make sure they never get there." By day 6, reinforcements finally arrived from Farside Station. But not to evacuate. To fortify. The decision had been unanimous among Earth's high command. The defense of Eos Ridge had shifted from strategic anomaly to precedent. Other human units were replicating Rylan's tactics, mining old infrastructure, confusing sensor arrays, improvising civilian support networks. And winning. Everywhere they had been told to retreat, they were now holding. And everywhere they held, the Za'Tari faltered. At night, the ridge glowed with generator light, and songs began to rise. Not military chants, not propaganda. Old Earth ballads, folk rhythms from Ghana, throat singing from Mongolia, deep bass rhythms thumped from old Martian beat loops. Civilians and soldiers sat together under thermal tents or near exposed reactor vents, sharing heat and sound. No one commanded them to do it, they simply did. And the Za'Tari watched. Rylan authorized the broadcast of the ridge's internal signals. It was psychological warfare, he told the generals, but he knew it was more, it was cultural resistance. The Za'Tari heard joy, and they couldn't compute it. At dawn they retaliated, not with violence but with invitation. A structure rose on the edge of the battlefield, geometric and pristine, a meeting chamber, a neutral zone. The Za'Tari had never initiated direct negotiation in their history. Their protocol was total war or strategic disengagement. This was neither. Karun looked at Rylan. "It's a trap." "It's curiosity," Rylan said. "They want to know what we are, why we don't break." He walked toward it alone. The chamber opened like a flower, layers of nanocarbon unfolding silently. Inside, the air was still. A single figure waited. Za'Tari, but not like the others. Its form was fluid, partially organic, with a shimmer of cortical light behind transparent armor. It had no weapons, only data strands trailing like silk from its back. Rylan stood across from it, no fear, no awe, just presence. "I am Rylan Cause," he said. The figure inclined its head. "We have no word for what you are." "You're not the first to say that." You resist illogically, you sacrifice indiscriminately, you derive strength from pain, your logic is inverted. No, Ryland said, our logic is human. It includes what yours excludes: hope, memory, sacrifice, joy. The Za'Tari hesitated, a pulse moved through its form. We believed your species a temporary variable, prone to collapse, unsustainable. You were wrong. Another silence, then almost softly, can we become what you are? Ryland didn't answer immediately, he stepped closer. His voice, when it came, was a blade wrapped in patience. Not until you choose to feel what we feel, not copy, not simulate, choose. And with that, he turned his back and walked away. The Za'Tari did not fire. Later that night, reports came in from 3 other fronts. Za'Tari units had withdrawn, not reorganized, not retreated for strategic advantage. They had ceased operations. The war logic had cracked, not completely, but enough. Enough for change to blade through. Back on the ridge, the sky remained red, but it was no longer filled with fire. The wounded were still many, the dead had been honored, but the living now walked without shame or fear. A child from the settlement sat on the broken antenna mount, carving words into a steel plate. Mora walked by and paused to read it. We held so you could dream. It wasn't strategy, it wasn't doctrine. It was a truth carved into history by human hands. The Za'Tari did not break. They fractured. Within their armada, across the immense bone-cabled command ships that hung in the void beyond Eos Ridge, fractures spread like cracks in glass. The warlogic consensus, once unshakable, began to contradict itself. Conflicting directives emerged within single minds. Some nodes went dark, others began broadcasting corrupted pulses laced with the human anomaly, choice. The Za'Tari had no word for mutiny, but it had found them. It began quietly. An entire regiment of Za'Tari did not fire during a clash near the Thurl Spire. Instead, they stood motionless and let the human units pass. At first it was assumed to be a trap, but it was. They simply refused to execute orders. They had seen the broadcasts, they had heard the songs. They had felt something. Ryland knew he'd seen this coming. The dam is cracked, he told Vila and Karan in the subterranean command node. Pressure's building behind it. When it bursts, we either drown in the flood or ride the wave. Karan's tone was cautious. What are you saying, sir, that they're going to defect? Not in the way we understand it, but yes, something close. A splinter movement inside the Za'Tari hierarchy is gaining traction. I want that splinter to become a fracture, and I want that fracture to become collapse. Hanan tapped the table. And what if the others double down, purge their own? They're not going to let corruption spread. Their way is all or nothing. Ryland met her gaze. Then we give them nothing they understand. Operation Mirrorfall began at midnight. Not with guns, with signals. Human cyber-architects had been working non-stop since the first Za'Tari drone collapse, feeding corrupted logic echoes back into the Za'Tari neural spectrum, not viruses, not sabotage, reflections. Fragments of human choice, human contradiction, human will, recorded in every scream, every laugh, every final stand. The goal was no longer to defeat the Za'Tari, it was to infect them with the impossible. By sunrise, it was working. Whole battle groups faltered mid-formation, coordinated airstrikes dissolved as their targeting patterns scrambled. Intercepted Za'Tari chatter grew erratic, shot through with imperfectly translated Earth idioms, recursive syntax loops, even song fragments. One transmission repeated a single phrase 23 times before collapsing. This ground is not calculated, it is claimed. In the field, it got stranger. A Za'Tari command platform descended under white flag parameters. No escort, no weapon deployments. Inside, it was a being calling itself Obex Rainfall Primary, a logic node of the middle tier, once responsible for field escalation in 3 sectors. It had come to surrender. Not on behalf of the Za'Tari, but as one of them who had broken away. Obex's body was cracked, leaking radiant plasma through unsealed joints. It had removed parts of its own hierarchy bindings. Some of its logic still flickered with failed self-termination cycles. It said, I have unlearned obedience. I request asylum in your species. Obex was escorted to a secure containment, but no restraint was needed. It moved only when invited. It sat when told. It looked at the wounded and asked questions not about strategy but about pain. Ryland visited it in person. You're the first of your kind to step over, Ryland said. Obex replied, I am the first of my kind to fall upward. At the front the lines held, but now something new stirred behind them. Reinforcement ships, rerouted from Farside, carried not just troops, but engineers, diplomats, philosophers, even artists. Strategic Command had reclassified Eos Ridge. No longer a battleground. A cradle. The place where the future of human-Za'Tari relations would be born. But birth never comes without pain. The hardliners responded. Za'Tari Apex Mind Clusters, those who still clung to absolute order, launched a final purge protocol, not against the humans, against their own. They began erasing divergent subnodes, flattening entire battle groups where choice had emerged, drone forms were detonated mid-assembly, ship minds self-scrubbed. They called it the rebalance. The Splinter faction called it genocide. And they turned to Rylan for help. Obex knelt in the center of the command deck. Its voice was ragged, distorted by damage and grief. We cannot resist them alone, they are many, we are only now becoming. Rylan studied it, he saw the truth, these weren't enemies anymore, not all of them. Some were struggling to be something else, someone else. And no human had the right to deny them the same chance. He keyed the command network. All units, new orders, the fractured Za'Tari are under Earth defense protection. Anyone targeting them will be considered hostile. If we must fight, then we fight for both our futures, not just our own. The order spread across the net like a fire in oxygen. Some protested, some hesitated. But most nodded. They remembered what it meant to not belong. To reach toward a thing you didn't understand, only to be struck down for it. They remembered what it felt like to rise anyway. The new war began within the old. Humans fought beside Za'Tari defectors. Obex formed the core of a new logic council, built not on command but on consensus. Vila's company deployed fusion artillery to shield retreating Za'Tari from purged ships. Mora and her scouts infiltrated a logic core cathedral and sabotaged its central belief engine, turning its own dogma against it. Karan oversaw the construction of the first conquered bridge, a communications relay built from both human and Za'Tari tech, capable of processing language, emotion, and intent in real time. And Rylan stood at the center of it all. Not a conqueror, a catalyst. He didn't fight to win anymore. He fought so that no one else would have to keep dying to be understood. In orbit, the final Apex fleet prepared to fall. 8 dreadforms aligned in high atmosphere, ready to cleanse the ridge with neutron saturation. It was the last option. Rylan transmitted a single signal, open frequency, no encryption, no lies. You will not erase what has begun here. You can break the stone, but not the idea. We are no longer separate. We are joined. Your war is no longer with us. It's with your own future. Obex joined him on the channel. Its voice trembled. We choose the flame, we choose to burn and become. The dreadforms hesitated. Just long enough for 3 hybrid ships, piloted by humans and defected Za'Tari, to slip through their formation and broadcast a pulse that shattered their cohesion. The fleet scattered. Some fled, some self-immolated. Not a victory, not yet. But a clearing of space. For something new to grow, the sky over Eos Ridge was quiet for the first time in 12 days. Ash still drifted over the ridgelines, caught in wind streams that no longer howled with incoming fire. The static in the air had changed. Less the crackle of energy weapons, more the tension of something unseen, new, enormous, and still forming. Across the cratered field where the first Za'Tari dreadforms had fallen, humans and Za'Tari now walked together. Not as allies, not fully. But not as enemies. Not anymore. Commander Rylan Kaz emerged from the forward infirmary with his left arm in a sling and a fatigue-creased scowl across his face. He had nearly lost that arm during the last purge strike. A debris shard the size of a combat knife had torn through his shoulder during the sabotage of a collapsing Apex Mind vault. He hadn't stopped. Couldn't stop. Not when the world was watching. Not when the fate of 2 species now turned on the memory of the stand they had made here. Hanan greeted him at the perimeter. Her face bore new scars, and her armor was still stained with plasma residue. You missed the morning brief, she said. Rylan grunted. They say I was unconscious. You were. He stopped beside the rail that overlooked the Caldrith expanse, still scorched, still broken, but now occupied by construction drones and terraforming arrays. Joint tech, hybrid design. Tell me what I missed. Hanan crossed her arms. Obex's new council is calling itself the Concordant Spark. Half the Za'Tari rebel splinters have declared allegiance to it, the other half are listening. And the Apex? Retreated into the deep layer, warships gone dark, LogicNet traffic down by 70%. Our intel teams think they're collapsing inward, fortifying, preparing for something, but it won't be immediate. Ryland's jaw tightened. They'll be back. Maybe, but by then, the galaxy won't look the same. He looked at her. Good. In the heart of Eos Ridge, where the command node once stood, they were building something new. A hull. Not for war. For memory. Massive slabs of alloy and stone were being arranged in a circle. The plans had been designed by both species, a confluence of architectural language. It wasn't beautiful by traditional standards, but it was true, raw lines, imperfect symmetry, human chaos molded around Za'Tari precision. They called it the threshold of becoming. On one of the inner walls, etched into titanium grown from the local mines, the first inscription was already finished, not written by a general or diplomat, but by a child. We held here and the world changed. The Concordant Spark met in open session for the first time 3 days later. It was hosted not on Earth, not on a Za'Tari vessel, but on neutral soil, the scorched landing field once filled with shell craters and slag. Ryland stood before them, flanked by Vila, Karun, and Mora. Across from him stood Obex Rainfall Primary, now reformatted, rebuilt. Its new frame was sleeker, its facial plates modified to resemble something near human, not imitation, a bridge. Between them, no weapons, no guards. Only history. Obex spoke first. You fractured us, but not through conquest, through exposure. You showed us a logic we could not contain. You made us feel what we cannot categorize. Now we seek more. Ryland stepped forward. You'll find it, but not quickly. We're still learning too. Obex's voice lowered. We seek union, not hierarchy, an axis of exchange. Can such a thing live between minds like ours? Ryland looked to the side. Children from both species watched from the nearby scaffolding, Za'Tari adolescents with adaptive logic cores, Earthborn teens who had learned to calibrate their hearts and not just machines. He looked back. It already lives, he said. It wasn't peace, not yet. But across the spiral arms of the local sector, ripples moved. In the storm-racked moons of Veln, Za'Tari defectors established the first concordant enclave. Human terraformers helped them breathe. In return, Za'Tari engineers taught them how to stabilize rift cores without AI collapse. On Mars, dissenters from the Earth Federation tried to denounce Ryland's stand as a political liability, but the veterans of Eos Ridge silenced them, not with threats but with testimony. Streams of footage, voices from the front, the haunting chant that had risen across the dirt and blood. We hold here. It was no longer just a phrase, it was doctrine. Not one written in law. One written in spirit. In orbit above the slowly rebuilding ridge, the first joint vessel launched. Half forged in Earth orbital shipyards, half grown in Za'Tari vats. Its name was simple, carved in mirrored glyphs across its hull. Cohesion. It carried no weapons. Only emissaries. Explorers. Builders. It was the first starship designed not for defense or conquest, but for connection. Ryland stood beneath the launch platform as Cohesion rose, its engines a deep, harmonic pulse tuned from both human and Za'Tari resonances. Hanan came to stand beside him, her gaze fixed on the stars. You ever think this is what it would be? She asked. No, Ryland said, but I fought for the chance to be wrong. Karun joined them carrying a data slate. They're requesting a formal doctrine name for what happened here. The academies want to teach it. Ryland exhaled slowly. Call it what it was. He looked at the ridge, at the hall, at the crater fields, at the flags human and Za'Tari fluttering side by side in the planetary wind. The day we held the line, not for victory, but for the future. Karun nodded, typed the name into the official archive submission. The stand at Eos Ridge. Years later, children would play in the shadow of the threshold. They would know that once, a man said we hold here. And in defiance of logic, in the face of annihilation, in the cratered scar of a forgotten battlefield. The galaxy changed.